June 29th, 1914. The people of London wake up early in the morning and prepare to go to their work. People wake up early and bustle throughout the streets. Now, although it seems like a regular day, the atmosphere seems different, heavier. On June 29th, the news is heard throughout all of Great Britain. The Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, has been assassinated. This leaves readers in widespread fear, and many understand what this could mean. War for all of Europe. Concerns over needless violence and death spread throughout the country. Meanwhile, while all this is occurring, Rudyard Kipling, a prominent Victorian author, is doing something very interesting. While many might expect that he'd be debating with politicians or writing articles about Britain's role in the war, Rudyard Kipling is writing poetry. Just a few months after the outbreak of what would become known as the First World War, For All We Have in Ours released to the public. It's a grave poem that warns of the importance of the upcoming conflict. The poem closes with this: "No easy hope or lies shall bring us to our goal, but iron sacrifice of body, will, and soul. There is but one life for all, one task for all, one life for each to give. What stands if freedom fall? Who dies if England live?" In just 8 lines, Kipling delivers an emotional call to action, and the message is clear to anyone who's reading. In order for Great Britain to survive, people must make sacrifices. Now, given the context of the time, we can all understand that means soldiers giving their lives on the battlefield for their country. Rudyard Kipling wasn't the only person to hold this belief. During the early stages of the war, propaganda was spread through leaflets and posters, but an interesting way it was spread was through poetry. Pro-war poems immediately sprung up, with titles such as Men Who March Away, War Girls, and Wake Up England, all of which spread this eager fervor for warfare. Now, in order to understand why these things had such a large effect on the English populace, we have to look a little bit farther back. Before the First World War, for much of the 1800s, Great Britain was in a time of great prosperity and progress. This time was known as the Victorian era and was understandably titled after the Queen of the time, Queen Victoria. Science and logic reached new heights, spearheaded by Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, and authors like Alfred Lord Tennyson and Charles Dickens pumped out work after work to critical and commercial success. Now, although we often think about this time as a time of great progress in the literary world, it wasn't exactly that way. In fact, much of the literary world focused still on traditional genres, one of which that I want to focus on is the adventure genre. Adventure genres often dealt with heroes who were stoic and faced their fears head-on, fighting evil and coming out on top with glory and honor. Many of you have probably experienced one of these in your life, one of them being the Three Musketeers, in which 3 swordsmen from France fight against evil and injustice in the 1600s. These stories found extreme popularity during this time, especially among one group, teenage boys. Now, while all this was happening, another key factor was happening across all of England. The view of an ideal man was shifting, and solidified into something that was very commonly seen in the adventure genre. The ideal man was seen as someone who was stoic, brave, who faced difficulty and danger head-on and never swayed their path. Understandably, when many teenage boys read these adventure stories, they saw that ideal man, and they wanted to be like that. So in 1914, when a little thing called World War I started, many people saw this as the ideal opportunity to prove their manhood. One such person I'd like to focus on today is Rupert Brooke. Now, Rupert Brooke was a prominent author before World War I, but most of his popularity occurred after the war started. He released many poems, one of his most popular being The Soldier, which opens with this: "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed." Here we can see the very same pro-war fervor spread by Kipling and others. Brooke shows an enthusiasm for warfare, almost an excitement for it, even if it means his death. Now, one thing distinguishes Rupert Brooke from his contemporaries, however. Brooke actually enlisted to fight for England in World War I. He believed in his beliefs so strongly that he was willing to prove it on the battlefield. With voices like Brooke and Kipling urging them on, thousands of young men eagerly enlisted, hoping to fight and get glory in a war that would be finished in no more than a few months. The year is now 1917. For the past 3 years, fighting has occurred across Europe, but no side has come out victorious. The promises of honor and glory by the pro-war poets have been shown to be no more than excited fantasy. Instead, soldiers spend their days living in trenches across France, where the most common cause of death is not by an exciting battle, but by disease. To these soldiers, the trenches of France is the closest they will ever get to hell. However, while all of this is happening, the public in England still support the war, causing many to question whether or not it was truly as righteous as the war was promised to be. In 1917, a poem is written by a young man named Wilfred Owen. Now, thousands of poems were written every year by English authors, but this one is different because Owen writes from his own perspective. Wilfred Owen, having been spurred on by propaganda, eagerly enlisted in the war in 1915. However, when he arrived in France, he was met with a reality that he did not expect at all. And soon after, he was diagnosed with shell shock, which is commonly known today as post-traumatic stress disorder. He was sent to Craig Lockhart War Hospital, where he spent his time recovering and writing poetry. During this period, he released Anthem for Doomed Youth, which opens with this: "What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle, can patter out their hasty orisons." In just 4 lines, Wilfred Owen distinguishes himself from his contemporaries. Where others saw the war as good and righteous and spread that message, Owen questions it and even criticizes it. He portrays the war as he saw it, as a needless cause of death where even the very humanity of soldiers was lost. Now, even though Wilfred Owen is the most prominent voice to emerge from World War I, he's not the only one to hold these beliefs. Thousands of soldiers served in the war during the whole entire 4 years, and many of them come to question whether or not it was good. But their voices were not heard or even accepted, because back home in the British public, they didn't want to hear that kind of thing. But by writing poetry, Wilfred Owen and others were able to spread that message to the people. They were able to give a voice to those who never were able to spread theirs. And by doing this, Owen accomplished more than many others did during his lifetime. Now, Wilfred Owen was discharged from Craig Lockhart in 1917, where he returned to the front lines of France. There, he continued to fight for a future in which all needless violence and bloodshed would be ended. However, he would never get to see that future, as he died just a few weeks before the war was ended in 1918. It's extremely easy to overlook the importance of World War I, and it's even easier to overlook the importance of its poetry at the time. However, by examining the poems here, we can understand why we shouldn't do that. First, if we overlook it, we fail to realize the impact World War I has on us today. Back in the early 1900s, the voice of people who wanted to challenge the government's actions were basically meaningless. Today, almost any conflict is met with at least some criticism by the media and by the public. That was by no means the case back then. However, you've probably seen through art the impact it's had. If you've ever heard a song from the 70s protesting the Vietnam War, or seen a movie that depicts warfare not as something full of honor and glory, but full of pain and suffering, you have felt the impacts of these soldier poets. And secondly, and why I care so much about poetry, is because it can deliver something we can never learn in any textbook or article. It can show us how people actually felt. By examining poetry from the First World War, we can understand why many of these soldiers lived, why they fought, and why they died. The very soldiers that fought for a future that was better for us all still live on to this very day.